Hi there! I promised I'd be back in September and I have just about made it. Thank you for your patience as I took some time to do other things, mainly work, the past few months. I hope you've had a pleasant summer. And we're here to dive straight back into a medieval poem full of Valkyries, fighting, blood, and guts. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's get medieval. Today we're talking about a poem called Darraðarljóð, which is an Old Norse skaldic poem, which you can find in one of the most famous of the Old Norse Íslendingasögur, or Sagas of Icelanders, sometimes also called the family sagas. And that famous saga itself is Njáls Saga, which sometimes in and of itself is also known as Brennu-Njáls Saga, or just simply Njála. What we're going to do is first I'm going to give you a bit of background to Njáls Saga itself, so we know what this poem, kind of what its context is. And then I'm going to tell you about the poem itself, which, as promised, is all about Valkyries kind of weaving weird webs out of guts and intestines. So if you don't really want to hear about guts and intestines on this Monday morning, then, well, I'll understand if you decide to turn off this episode. After I've talked about the poem with you, we're then going to look at some of, the afterlife of this poem, how it might have inspired part of Shakespeare's Weird Sisters, and also just that interesting connection between women, weaving, and doom. So, with all that said, let's just dive straight in. So, first and foremost, context. The poem that we're going to talk about is, like I said, found in the saga called Njáls Saga. Njáls Saga really just translates to the Saga of Njáll. As I said, the saga has different names, some being Brennu-Njáls Saga, which already gives a bit of a hint as to what is going to happen in the saga, because that translates to the Saga of Burnt Njáll. Njáls Saga is one of the most famous Icelandic family sagas. It has a lot of respect within the field, I would say. A lot of people, and especially scholars of Old Norse literature, kind of uphold it as the best saga. Njáls Saga kind of takes place or describes events which might have occurred between 960 and 1020. So it covers quite a long period of time. And as always, we get to see a couple of different generations taking place. However, the most important figures of the saga really are two men. One of them is the eponymous Njáll. He is a lawyer. He's also something of a very wise man. People trust him, and he always has good advice. And another is Gunnar, who is an excellent warrior, also a very good man. But Gunnar has a problem, which is his wife, Hallgerður. She is a bit rambunctious, I would say. And she has something of a disagreement with Njál's wife. So a big part of the saga also kind of covers the conflicts between these two families, while the two men, Njál and Gunnar, try to keep the peace. Issues keep arising, feuds keep kind of breaking out, and they can't really set them to right. And at some point, the sons of Njál kill his foster son, called Höskuldur. And Njáll himself is very sad about this, because Höskuldur was a great man. But this is a turning point in the saga, and it happens about halfway through. Höskuldur's wife then incites her uncle, Flosi, to take vengeance, or at least get compensation for Höskuldur. So they have a meeting, and they talk about it, and they're so close to managing to kind of strike a settlement where no bloodshed has to happen. But then one of Njál's sons, who is called Skarphedin, he's not the luckiest of people. He's kind of doomed by the narrative, I would say. He says something stupid, does something stupid with his face, and the settlement falls apart. And now violent vengeance has to be taken. And this leads to what the title of the saga already suggests, which is the burning of Njál, his wife, and most of his sons in their home. This is a tragedy. It's probably also based on real events, or at least around the time that people think the saga might have been written down in parchment. A whole burning had also taken place, which is attested in historical sources. So this was clearly a quite traumatic, terrible thing. So this whole family gets burnt in their hall. One man, a son-in-law of Njáll, he survives, although his wife dies, if I remember correctly, and he is called Kauri. And because he's the sole survivor and he's heartbroken by what has happened, of course he has to take vengeance, because that's quite simply how it works. So he tracks the men who have kind of committed this crime, who did the whole burning. He tracks them across the north. And at a certain point, he tracks the last man, Flosi, all the way to Great Britain and to the Orkney Islands, where Flosi is currently hiding with, or at least given shelter by a Jarl. Now this Jarl decides that it is time for warfare, and so he heads to Ireland to take part in the Battle of Clontarf, which took place just outside of Dublin in 1014. Again, this is a historical battle, and the saga just places its main characters there. So we are at this epic battle, the Battle of Clontarf, where loads of people are going to die. But the saga tells us that around the time that this battle was about to start, weird supernatural kind of omens or signs were being seen. And one of these was something that a man called Darraðarljóð witnessed. And that is where the poem comes in that we're going to talk about. Now the following happens. Darraðarljóð is riding around when suddenly he sees these 12 people. And he can't really specify who or what they are yet. He sees them riding towards a building, towards a hall, and then they kind of disappear, and he's like, that's odd, that's interesting. And so he creeps up to that house, and he looks through a window, as you do, and he sees that these people are actually women, ? And they have set up a loom. But instead of kind of normal weights, they're using the heads of men. And instead of normal thread, etc., they're using the entrails of people, and they're using a sword as a shuttle, and the reels with which they're weaving are arrows. And then they begin to sing a song or recite a poem. And the saga tells us that he learned these words by heart, and that is why we now have them recorded. And that song or that poem is the Darraðarljóð. This poem is made up of 11 stanzas. And like I said, they're like a song. So we have certain themes that are repeating. On top of that, it is skaldic poetry. And poetry is always a little complicated because, poets play with imagery, with symbolism, with rhyme, with meter, with alliteration, and all of those kind of things. Skaldic poetry, I would say, is extra difficult. There are scholars who dedicate their entire careers to figuring out kind of skaldic poetry, the imagery they're working with, etc. So it's not necessarily the most straightforward of poems, but it creates a lot of atmosphere. So Darraðarljóð, the poem, starts with the idea that blood is raining down upon this loom of slaughter, where the Valkyries are weaving a crimson weft. The second stanza repeats what the prose said before, which is that the warp is made of human entrails, human heads are the weights, that the rods are spears, that there's arrows involved, that the swords will weave the web of battle. The third stanza tells us about the Valkyries who are actually undertaking the weaving. So we get a couple of names. There is one called Hildur, for example, which is very interesting because that word means battle in and of itself. Valkyries in Old Norse literature, mythology, legend usually have names that link them to battle already. They say that spears will shatter and shields will splinter. Yes, Tolkien absolutely read this as well when he wrote the speech for the Battle or the Charge of the Rohirrim. We then get something that almost functions like a bit of a refrain throughout the poem, and I'm going to read you George Webb Dason's translation. Admittedly, it is from 1861, so it's a bit outdated, but it is one that you can find online, which is why I'll be reading that one and linking to it later. This stanza goes, "Wind we, wind swiftly, our war-winning woof. Woof erst for King Youthful, foredoomed as his own. Forth now we will ride, then through the ranks rushing, be busy where friends, blows blithe, give and take. Wind we swiftly, our war-winning woof. After that, let us steadfastly stand by the brave king. Then men shall mark, mournful, their shields red with gore, how sword stroke and spear thrust stood stout by the prince." So here we get this idea that these Valkyries, as they are spinning this web, are deciding who will win this battle. And they've chosen the prince, the king, they've chosen one specific person. And of course, the battle that is taking place is the Battle of Clontarf. They say how the Valkyries will be the ones who choose the slain, which is very interesting because that's exactly what their name means. The Old Norse word Valkyria is made up of the elements valr, which means the dead, the slain, and a second element which comes from the verb kyrja, to choose. So in their names in and of itself, the word Valkyrie means the chooser of the slain, so we get that here as well. It's always nice when etymology fits narrative. They talk about how they will pronounce which king will die, how the land will be ruled by new people, that the men of Ireland will suffer grief, and that this battle kind of will never, and this grief will never grow old. Now that their web is woven, the news of disasters may spread. And they also admit that it is horrible to look around. They sing victory songs, and, well, if one wins, then, well, the other loses. And they then say that whoever hears the Valkyrie song should make sure to remember it well, so that he can then share it. Now, they say in the last stanza, they'll get back on their horses and they will hasten into battle. So that's what they do. They've created this whole kind of web, or maybe more like woven piece, and they then tear it apart because now they know what fate or what destiny is designed. And Darraðarljóð, our protagonist in this little episode of the saga, then sees through his little window sill and then from the outside that they come out on their horses, and that 6 ride to the south and the other 6 to the north. And that is really the whole episode. That is your context as well as what happens in the poem. And it's just a fascinating bit of mythology and lore. So with that, we have Darraðarljóð. I adore this poem because whenever I teach my students about Valkyries and we look through other texts, they never quite are what students want them to be until we look at Darraðarljóð and are like, yes, here are the women with swords determining battle and using kind of human entrails and being all kinds of gross but cool. So that's always fun. But then it is also worth pointing out that the figure of the Valkyrie is incredibly ambiguous in Old Norse mythology, Old Norse legend. So Njáls Saga itself is not super old. Of course, it is medieval, right? So it does feel old if you compare it to kind of now and the modern day. But the saga itself is, well, most likely from the mid to late 13th century. So some scholars have said probably 1270 to 1290. But this mythology existed a long time before. We have archaeological findings of little figurines that may have been Valkyries. We have Valkyries who appear in the Eddic poems. But even then, you're like, okay, so the Edda, that's the mythology. That must be a bit older, right? Like, no, the Poetic Edda, where most of these poems come from, is also from the 1270s. So these are already a late medieval reception. So a reading of, a response to older folklore and mythology. Because by 1270, Iceland was solidly Christian, right? So they still had their mythology and their folklore, of course, but most people were living in a Christian reality. And so it was more of an echo, really. But this was something that echoed strongly because why else would a saga author include this fascinating little nugget about Valkyries and them determining battles into a saga that was otherwise about not paranormal, not supernatural events, but about the conflicts of men? So the Valkyrie, she is ambiguous. Is she a woman or is she a spirit? Does she serve Odin or does she herself get to decide who dies? Is she more of a messenger or is she the one who makes the choices? Well, all of those are very interesting questions, so it's good that you're asking yourself those, but we don't know. And this is why Valkyries is such an interesting topic. I was just at a conference and people are still doing so much work trying to compare different pieces of literature or poetry in which they appear to try and figure out if we can actually come up with a solid definition of what a Valkyrie is, or if rather Valkyrie is just a word that has a lot of associations, and that can mean almost anything in any given context. But here in Njáls Saga, in Darraðarljóð, she is a woman who decides the fate and doom of men on the battlefield. And that is, of course, very interesting. Many authors, poets, even playwrights, were inspired by this idea of not just the Valkyries in general, but specifically the Valkyries as weaving fate and destiny, because it is an idea that echoes throughout so much of mythology, legend, and literature. Of course, we have the three witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, who are also known as the Wyrd sisters or the Wayward sisters, because in the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, they're actually known as the Wayward sisters, but usually nowadays they're known as the Wyrd sisters. And there, weird does not necessarily mean what weird means nowadays. Nowadays, weird means a little bit odd. But that word comes from the Old English Wyrd with a Y instead of an EI. And there it is more about a sense of fate. Wyrd is also a word where a direct translation, a clear definition, is sometimes hard to find, as all ideas of fate, destiny, and doom really are. You can't really define them, but you can feel them. So these Wyrd sisters in Shakespeare's Macbeth, they also get to decide which king wins, and they get to prophesy which man will be the one to lead Scotland. And in that case, they choose Macbeth, but they've also already ordained his death, haven't they? So there we play with this idea again of women and fate, and them kind of weaving these weird things together. So Shakespeare's Wyrd sisters were not just inspired by these Valkyries, but also by equally nebulous figures, the Norns of Norse mythology, the Witch of Endor from the Bible, and of course the Greek Fates, who were also women who very actively spun destiny. So what is it, this link between women, destiny, and weaving? Well, you see this pop up in a lot of different cultures, women weaving, and then that weft kind of being more than just material. On the one hand, this makes a lot of sense because weaving was mostly a women's occupation in the Middle Ages, the early modern period, and even now, although I'm also seeing more men engaging in knitting and crocheting, so that's fun. But women would have been the ones to weave clothing, but also the sails for ships to go to war, etc. So this was an activity that women often did. And during this activity, no doubt, they would have sung songs or talked about things, talked about their worries or concerns maybe about what would have happened. Maybe they would have made some small predictions in the hope that, you know, if you're weaving a shirt for your husband, brother, father as he's about to go off to war, you might just stitch in all of your hope that he would be okay. On top of that, so that natural almost association between women and weaving, there is also a connection between women and knowledge in a lot of mythology and literature. I'll see if I can find some interesting secondary literature to link you to on that, but it is more of a kind of nebulous connection again, I would say. There's the idea of women as these kind of holders of culture. Women are the ones who remember the past, who remember tradition and thereby ensure the continuation of a society's culture. And so if you've already imbued women with a certain amount of wisdom and with the weaving, well, then that connection becomes quite natural. You'd be like, they weave, they know things. And if you then add just a thin layer of misogyny, or a thick one, depending on whatever kind of ancient or medieval text you're reading, that can turn to bad very quickly. Because what are these women up to? Why do they know so many things? What are they weaving? Why are they so involved in things that we men think they shouldn't be involved in, which is warfare and politics and the continuation of a nation or a peoples? We didn't have nations in the Middle Ages. So that's how you get this kind of accumulation of different ideas and themes which then might find expression. You have the idea of women being involved in warfare because of their weaving. You have the idea of women as the holders of stories and culture and history and tradition, which gives them a certain knowledge of the past and therefore maybe a certain knowledge of the future. And you have this concern about women getting involved where they shouldn't, knowing things that they shouldn't, and maybe being mad at you and foretelling your doom and your death. Bring all of that together and you might get something mythological like Darraðarljóð, like the Wyrd sisters, like the ancient Greek Moirai. So yeah, I love Darraðarljóð, and it's not just Shakespeare either who found this very interesting. There is also the poet Thomas Gray, who wrote a poem called The Fatal Sisters, an ode, which is mostly a translation of the Old Norse, but he also added his own flavor. And I'm just going to read you some stanzas, and I'll link to the poem at the Poetry Foundation website below. Here we go. As the paths of fate we tread, wading through the ensanguined field, gondola and gera spread o'er the youthful king your shield. We the reins to slaughter give, ours to kill and ours to spare. Spite the danger he shall live, weave the crimson web of war. So yeah, that's also very nice. That gives you a maybe more poetic sense than the Old Norse, or the direct translation of the Old Norse by Dasent. So this has been our first dive back into the podcast, into the Middle Ages. We've seen Valkyries, we've seen battles, we've seen guts, gore, and human heads. We've explored a bit of Shakespeare. We've seen some other poetry. We've wondered why women and weaving and doom are so connected. And maybe we don't have more answers, but I would say we have more informed questions, perhaps. So I'm going to do my very best to get back to a more regular kind of scheduling and posting again as we move into October. But for now, I hope that you had a lovely summer, that you've enjoyed today's episode, and that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.